She never thought much of it, until the new girl at school looked exactly like her. Same face, same birthmark, same everything. A DNA test was supposed to be a joke, until the results revealed the impossible. They were sisters, but if they were born together, why were they raised apart? And what buried family secret had kept them from the truth? As they dig deeper, they uncover a past that was never meant to be revealed, one that could change everything. Some secrets bring families together, others tear them apart. This one, it could do both. Stay until the very end, because this story is just getting started. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. John Callahan's fingers drummed against the steering wheel of his patrol car, his tired eyes scanning the empty parking lot. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the ice-slicked pavement, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed. Just another night in Chicago's South Side. The bitter winter air seeped through the car's aging heater, making him pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He glanced at his watch, 11:47 p.m. His shift had technically ended 17 minutes ago, but the thought of going home made his chest tight. The cold leather seat of his patrol car felt more welcoming than his own living room these days. At least here, the silence made sense. Running a calloused hand over his face, John felt the rough stubble beneath his fingers. When was the last time he'd had a real conversation with Sarah or Stephen? The memory of breakfast that morning flashed through his mind. His wife silently stirring her coffee, his teenage son hunched over his cereal bowl, phone in hand. The only sounds had been spoons clinking against dishes and chairs scraping across the floor as they'd left without a word. The morning sun had streamed through the kitchen window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the growing distance between them. "Some family man you turned out to be," he muttered to himself, his breath fogging in the cold car. The words hung heavy in the air, a truth he couldn't escape. The police scanner crackled with routine calls. A domestic dispute on 82nd Street, an attempted robbery at a convenience store, gang activity suspected near Washington Park. John barely registered the voices anymore. They'd become white noise over his 13 years on the force. Each call represented another family in crisis, another story he couldn't fix, just like his own. He reached for his thermos, finding it empty. The bitter dregs of coffee left a stale taste in his mouth. Maybe he should just head home, try to catch Stephen before the kid went to bed. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe dash. The scanner burst to life with renewed urgency. Structure fire, possible vagrants inside, 104th Street and Ashland. The dispatcher's voice carried an edge that cut through John's exhaustion like a knife. John's body tensed, years of training kicking in. He sat up straighter, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he grabbed the radio. His fingers closed around the familiar plastic, steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "Dispatch, this is Officer Callahan, I'm on it." The engine roared to life and John flipped on his sirens. The patrol car's tires struggled for grip on the icy streets as he navigated through the empty roads. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, muscles tense as he took each turn with practiced precision. The red and blue lights painted the surrounding buildings in alternating colors, a familiar dance he'd seen countless times before. As he rounded the final corner onto Ashland, the night sky glowed orange. Flames reached upward from what used to be a 3-story warehouse, their hungry fingers clawing at the darkness. The heat was visible even from a distance, distorting the air like a mirage. Sparks drifted upward like fireflies, carried on currents of superheated air. John barely had time to park before he spotted him, a man in tattered clothes, frantically waving his arms at the newly arrived firefighters. His face was streaked with soot, eyes wild with panic. His voice carried across the crackling of the flames. "Someone's inside." I heard screaming. The words hit John like a physical blow. He could see the firefighters preparing their equipment, but they were moving too slowly. Everything was moving too slowly. The flames weren't waiting. They were growing, consuming, destroying. The crackle of burning wood and the distant wail of approaching sirens filled his ears. Without conscious thought, John was out of his car, the cold air shocking his lungs as he ran toward the building. The heat grew intense, like standing too close to an open oven. A firefighter spotted him, reached out to grab his arm, his heavy glove rough against John's sleeve. "Wait for backup!" John yanked his arm free, his feet already carrying him forward. The smoke was thick now, stinging his eyes, but he could see the entrance. The doorway gaped like a mouth, black smoke pouring out in heavy clouds. The heat pressed against him like a physical wall, making each breath more difficult than the last. Taking one last deep breath of clean air, John stepped into the darkness, the roar of the flames drowning out everything else. The orange glow of the fire illuminated his path like a hellish beacon, guiding him deeper into the inferno. The heat hit John like a wall as he burst through the front door of the burning building. Flames licked up the walls, turning everything into an orange hellscape. The smoke was thick and black, forcing him to stay low, his knees scraping against the debris-strewn floor. Years of police training had taught him to stay calm in crisis situations, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. His throat tightened with each passing second as the reality of what he was doing sank in. The acrid smell of burning wood and plastic filled his nostrils, even through the cloth he'd pulled over his nose and mouth. Sweat immediately began to bead on his forehead, trickling down into his stinging eyes. His free hand remained on his holstered weapon, not out of fear of danger, but as an anchor, something familiar in this chaos. The metal was warm to the touch, even through his jacket, a testament to the intense heat surrounding him. For several endless seconds, all he could hear was the deafening roar of the fire. The flames seemed alive, hungry, consuming everything in their path with an almost supernatural voracity. Windows had already shattered from the intense heat, and the winter air rushing in only seemed to feed the inferno, creating swirling eddies of smoke that danced like malevolent spirits in the flickering light. Then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold despite the blistering heat. A cry, weak and desperate, barely audible above the fire's rage. John's head whipped toward a dark hallway to his left, his police instincts zeroing in on the source. Every fiber of his being tensed, ready to act. "Chicago PD," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke and strain. "If you can hear me, call out." The words scraped against his raw throat like sandpaper. Only another muffled cry answered him. The building groaned ominously overhead, and John knew time was running out. The structure wouldn't hold much longer. He moved faster, pushing through the thick smoke toward the hallway, his shoulders hunched against the oppressive heat. A thunderous crack split the air. John barely jumped back in time as a burning beam crashed down in front of him, sending up a shower of sparks and embers that peppered his face and arms with tiny points of pain. The heat was becoming unbearable, and his lungs burned with each breath, feeling like they were filling with liquid fire. But that cry, he couldn't ignore it. Not when someone needed him. Coughing violently, eyes watering, John carefully stepped over the fallen beam. His boots crunched on broken glass and charred wood as he pushed forward. The smoke was getting thicker, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The beam of his flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the roiling darkness. He found a doorway, half collapsed, the door hanging from one hinge like a broken wing. The crying was louder now, more desperate, cutting through the roar of the flames. John shouldered through the weakened door, sending it crashing to the floor with a shower of sparks. His flashlight beam cut through the smoke, revealing a scene that made his heart stop and his breath catch in his already burning throat. An overturned crib lay in the corner of what must have been a nursery, its white paint now blackened and peeling. And there, huddled against the wall, were two small figures. The larger one, probably no more than 4 years old, was curled protectively around a baby, both of them pressed as far into the corner as they could get, like frightened animals seeking shelter from a storm. A loud crack echoed from above as the ceiling began to give way, sending down a rain of burning debris. John didn't think. He moved. His body was already in motion, lunging toward the children as pieces of the burning ceiling started to rain down around them, his police training taking over completely. The older child looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, clutching the baby tighter against a small chest that heaved with panicked breaths. John reached out, his voice as gentle as he could make it despite the urgency of the situation, fighting to keep the fear from showing. "It's okay. I'm here to help. We need to go now." His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Another thunderous crack from above emphasized his words, sending more burning debris cascading down around them. There was no time left for hesitation. John moved forward, arms outstretched toward the children as the building continued to crumble around them, silently praying he'd be fast enough to save them both. The smoke-filled room made John's eyes water as he took in the sight before him. Where he'd expected to find one child, there were two tiny babies, no more than a year old, huddled together in the corner. Their small faces were streaked with soot, their whimpers barely audible above the roar of the flames. They were identical, twins, and both looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. John's police training kicked in automatically, pushing aside his shock. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy jacket, his movements quick but gentle as sweat trickled down his temples. "It's okay, little ones," he murmured, carefully wrapping the thick material around both babies. The twins' cries grew softer as he bundled them together, creating a protective cocoon against the smoke and heat that pressed in from all sides. "I got you," he whispered, gathering them into his arms. Their combined weight was substantial, but adrenaline coursed through his body, making them feel lighter than they were. The babies clutched at his uniform shirt with tiny fingers, their faces pressing against his chest as if seeking refuge in his strength. Their trust in him, even in this terrifying moment, made his throat tight with emotion. A deafening crack split the air above them. John's head snapped up just as the ceiling began to give way, orange flames licking through the spreading cracks. "Damn it," he cursed, lunging toward the doorway. The extra weight of the twins threw off his balance, making him stumble. His shoulders slammed into the doorframe as a burning beam crashed down behind him, sending up a shower of sparks and effectively sealing off their exit route. The heat seared against his back, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to being trapped. Smoke poured in thicker now, making it almost impossible to breathe. John pulled the babies closer, using his body to shield them from the worst of it. The hallway stretched before them, their only remaining escape route. He ran, each step careful despite his speed, aware of the weakening floor beneath his feet. The crackle of flames seemed to chase them, like a hungry predator closing in on its prey. The smoke was suffocating, filling his lungs with every desperate breath. His eyes burned, tears streaming down his face as he tried to maintain his bearings in the hellish corridor. The twins were silent now, and he prayed they were just quiet, not overcome by the smoke. His heart pounded against his ribs as he saw the staircase ahead was already starting to collapse, flames eating away at the wooden steps like ravenous termites. Through the haze, he spotted it, an open window at the end of the hall, a beacon of hope in the chaos. The glass had already blown out from the heat, and cold winter air rushed in, creating an eerie tunnel effect with the smoke. There was no time to think, no time to consider options. The building was coming down around them, groaning and shrieking like a dying beast. John tightened his grip on the precious bundle in his arms and ran straight for the window. The flames were closing in from all sides, the heat becoming unbearable, singeing his eyebrows and the hair on his arms. With no other choice, he jumped, saying a silent prayer for protection. The world seemed to slow down as they fell through the frigid night air. John twisted his body, making sure he would take the impact instead of the babies. He hit the snow-covered ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs like a sledgehammer to his chest. Pain shot through his back and shoulders, but his arms remained locked around the twins, keeping them safe against his chest. The cold snow beneath him was a shocking contrast to the inferno they'd just escaped. Rolling onto his side, John looked up just in time to see the building collapse behind them. The structure folded in on itself with a thunderous roar, sending up a massive cloud of smoke and embers into the night sky like a dystopian fireworks display. Screams erupted from the gathered crowd, but all John could focus on was the soft movement of the twins in his arms, alive and safe. Their tiny hearts beat against his chest, a rhythm more precious than any symphony he'd ever heard. The bitter winter air hit John's lungs like needles as he stumbled out of the collapsing building. His knees gave way, and he sank into the snow, still clutching the twins protectively against his chest. The babies were surprisingly quiet now, their tiny hands gripping his shirt as if they knew he was their lifeline. Their dark eyes, so trusting and innocent, peered up at him through the chaos. Sirens wailed closer and red lights painted the snow-covered ground in an eerie dance of shadows. John's chest heaved with violent coughs, but he didn't loosen his hold on the infants. His eyes stung from the smoke and his throat felt like sandpaper, but none of that mattered. The babies were safe. He could feel their steady heartbeats against his chest, a reassuring rhythm amid the mayhem. "We've got them! We've got them!" Multiple voices called out as paramedics rushed toward him through the swirling snow. John instinctively tightened his grip, his protective instincts still in overdrive. The twins were warm and alive against him. He couldn't let go, not yet. Something primal in him refused to release these precious lives he'd just saved. A female paramedic knelt beside him in the snow, her uniform dusted with white flakes. Her name tag read, Lisa Carter. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Officer, you're hurt. Let us take them." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and something in her calm demeanor finally broke through his defensive stance. Her kind eyes reminded him of his training. He needed to trust his fellow first responders. With trembling hands, John allowed the paramedics to take the babies. His arms felt strangely empty as they whisked the twins away to a waiting ambulance. He watched, still on his knees, as they were carefully examined under bright lights. Their matching onesies were smudged with soot but otherwise unmarked, a small miracle given what they'd just survived. "Where's their mother?" someone in the crowd called out, the voice cutting through the night air like a knife. The question hung heavy in the cold night air. John looked around at the gathering crowd of onlookers, but no one stepped forward. No desperate parent came running. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of flames and the steady stream of water from the fire hoses. Behind him, firefighters battled the remaining flames, their hoses creating steam as water met fire in a violent hiss. Another paramedic tried to lead John to an ambulance, but he waved them off. "I'm fine," he insisted between coughs, though his lungs felt like they were on fire. They compromised by treating his minor burns right there in the snow, the sting of antiseptic barely registering through his worry. Detective cars pulled up, their headlights cutting through the smoke that still hung in the air like a thick curtain. John watched as they began taking statements from witnesses, but his attention kept drifting back to the ambulance where the twins were being examined. He couldn't explain the pull he felt toward them, the need to ensure their safety. "They're perfectly fine," Lisa called over to him, seeing his concerned looks. "Not even a scratch. It's a miracle, really." She gave him a reassuring smile that did little to ease the knot in his stomach. John nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles protesting every movement. The ambulance doors closed with a definitive click, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, its lights flashing but sirens silent. He watched it disappear into the night, feeling an unexpected ache in his chest that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation. Standing there in the snow, his uniform covered in soot and his face streaked with smoke, John couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Those babies had been alone in that burning building. No mother, no father, no one to claim them. The cop in him couldn't let that go. 20 years on the force had taught him that coincidences rarely existed, especially when it came to abandoned children. "I'll find out," he whispered to himself as he watched the ambulance's taillights fade into the distance. The words disappeared into the cold night air, carried away by the wind and the dying sounds of the fire behind him. It was a promise, to himself, to those innocent babies, and to whatever force had brought them into his life tonight. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as John pushed through the heavy glass doors. His muscles screamed with every movement, a painful reminder of last night's rescue. The smell of smoke still clung to his uniform, mixing with the stale coffee scent that perpetually haunted the building. His hands were raw and blistered, the skin tender from gripping the hot metal of the fire escape. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the image of those tiny faces in the burning building. The sound of their frightened cries still echoed in his ears. but there was a small spark of pride in his chest. He'd saved lives last night. Surely that counted for something, even if his body felt like it had been hit by a truck. The usual morning bustle of the precinct fell silent as he walked in. Officers who normally greeted him with casual nods suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Others whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes following him with what looked like disapproval. The clicking of keyboards and shuffling of papers seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. Detective Mark Connolly leaned against the water cooler, a coffee cup in his weathered hand. His lined face twisted into a smirk as John passed, his eyes cold and mocking. "So you played the hero, huh, Callahan?" He took a slow sip. "Risked your life for two kids that'll probably end up in the system anyway. Real smart career move there." The words hit John like a physical blow. His steps faltered, but he kept walking, his shoulders tense. The weight of his badge felt suddenly heavy against his chest. "Officer Callahan." Captain Briggs's gravelly voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. "My office. Now." John followed the captain into his cramped office where papers covered every surface, and blinds filtered the morning light into thin strips. The air was thick with tension and the lingering scent of yesterday's cigars. Briggs didn't even look up as he shuffled through a stack of forms, his movements deliberately slow. "Here." The captain thrust a single sheet of paper toward John. "Your commendation letter. Standard procedure for this kind of thing." John took it, the paper feeling flimsy and meaningless in his hands. The typed words blurred before his tired eyes. "Good work, Callahan," Briggs muttered, still focused on his paperwork. "But next time, wait for backup. We don't need another dead hero on the front page. Department's got enough PR headaches as it is." "Sir," John's voice was tight. "Those kids were left to die. There wasn't time to wait." Briggs finally looked up, his expression tired and indifferent. "Not our problem anymore. Child Protective Services is handling it. Let them deal with the aftermath." John turned to leave, his teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. The commendation letter crumpled slightly in his grip as he reached his desk. Then he heard it, a low mutter from somewhere in the room, just loud enough to carry. "Should have let the fire do its job." Something snapped inside him. John's fist came down hard on his desk, the sharp crack making everyone jump. Coffee sloshed from nearby mugs. "Say that again," he growled, his voice dangerous and low. "I dare you." The room fell deadly quiet. Officers suddenly became intensely interested in their paperwork or computer screens. No one would meet his eyes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the endless buzz of the fluorescent lights. John stood there for a moment, his hand stinging from the impact, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. The realization hit him hard. These people, his supposed brothers and sisters in blue, didn't care. They didn't care about two innocent babies left to die in a burning building. They didn't care about doing what was right. The thin blue line he'd once believed in seemed more like a wall now, keeping humanity out. Without another word, he walked out, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. The commendation letter lay forgotten on his desk, as meaningless as the badge he'd once worn with pride. The halls of Bright Future's foster home were decked with paper chains and tinsel, a brave attempt at holiday cheer. A scraggly artificial Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights blinking weakly, some bulbs already burnt out. John shifted uncomfortably in the waiting area, his police uniform feeling too stiff, too official for this place. The plastic chair creaked beneath his weight, adding to his unease. Children's laughter echoed from another room, but it only made the quiet desperation here feel more pronounced. His hands were sweating, leaving damp spots on his dark blue pants. After a week of pulling strings and calling in favors, making countless phone calls and visits to government offices, he'd finally tracked down where the twins had been placed. The social worker, Mrs. Jenkins, emerged from her office. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and kind wrinkles creased around her eyes. She carried a thick manila folder under one arm. "Officer Callahan? This way, please." She led him through a corridor lined with children's artwork to a large playroom. John spotted them immediately, the twins he'd carried from the fire. Micah and Malachi sat in a playpen, identical down to their matching blue onesies and tiny white socks. They looked so small, so vulnerable, yet somehow stronger than the last time he'd seen them. Their dark eyes took in everything around them with an alertness that seemed beyond their age. "Can I?" John's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, fighting back the surge of emotion. "Can I hold one of them?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her tired eyes studying him, perhaps seeing something in his face that touched her. After a moment, she nodded. "Just for a little while." John reached down and carefully lifted Micah. The baby immediately grabbed onto his uniform shirt, tiny fingers curling into the fabric with surprising strength. Malachi watched from the playpen, his head tilted slightly in curiosity, following his brother's movement with intense focus. "You're safe now," John whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The weight of the child in his arms felt right, familiar, like something he'd been missing without knowing it. He thought about that night, carrying them through the flames, and his chest tightened with the memory of heat and fear. Across the room, a young couple was finishing adoption paperwork for a baby girl, their faces glowing with joy. They looked so happy, so ready to start their family, passing a pen back and forth as they signed their names. John watched them, an ache growing in his chest. He knew the system inside and out. A single cop working the night shift would never be approved as an adoptive parent. His own marriage was falling apart. He barely saw his teenage son anymore. The weekend visits had dwindled to quick phone calls and awkward silences. Mrs. Jenkins must have noticed his expression. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch motherly and understanding. "They'll find a home soon, Officer Callahan. They're young, and twins are special. People love adopting twins." John forced a smile, but it felt brittle, like glass ready to shatter. "I hope so." He looked down at Micah, who had dozed off against his chest, one tiny fist still clutching his uniform. The trust of this tiny being overwhelmed him, made his heart ache in ways he couldn't explain. With great reluctance, he lowered Micah back into the playpen next to his brother. The twins immediately scooted closer to each other, their connection obvious even at this young age, as they huddled together like two pieces of a puzzle. Standing there watching them, John made a silent vow. One day they would know about this night, about the man who couldn't save them twice, who had to walk away even though every fiber of his being wanted to stay. He turned and walked out into the cold December night, each step feeling heavier than the last. The winter wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed, his mind still back in that room with two small boys who had somehow worked their way into his heart. The TV flickered in John's dimly lit apartment, casting dancing shadows on the water-stained walls. An old noir film played, the kind he used to love, but now it just filled the silence. The black and white characters moved across the screen, their problems seeming so much simpler than real life. He shifted on his worn leather recliner, his bad knee protesting the movement. 20 years of walking a beat had taken their toll, forcing him into early retirement. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, their familiar cry echoing through the concrete canyons. Some things never changed in this part of Chicago. John reached for his coffee mug, found it empty, and sighed. The ceramic was still warm against his fingers, a small comfort in the chill. The radiator in the corner clanked and sputtered, barely keeping the December chill at bay, its rusty pipes groaning with each burst of heat. His gaze drifted to the stack of mail on his scratched coffee table, the pile growing taller with each passing day. Bills, probably. Maybe another Christmas card from the police union, filled with generic well wishes from people who'd already forgotten his name. Nothing from Steven. There hadn't been for months. His son's last text message had been brief. "Can't make it for Thanksgiving. Work's busy." The words still stung, weeks later. John pulled open his side table drawer and took out a yellowed newspaper clipping, handling it with the care of a precious artifact. He'd kept it all these years, though he couldn't say why. The headline still stood out bold against the aging paper. "Hero cop saves twin boys from house fire." Below it, a younger version of himself stood awkwardly before the cameras, his uniform covered in soot, his eyes showing the exhaustion of that endless night. "Did it even matter?" he muttered, running his calloused fingers over the faded ink, tracing the letters as if they might reveal some hidden truth. The question haunted him more often lately, especially during these long winter nights. Where are they now? He'd tried to follow up over the years, making calls, asking old contacts, but the system was designed to protect privacy. After a while, he'd stopped asking, accepting the wall of silence. But on nights like this, when the silence pressed in too close, he wondered about those two tiny faces he'd pulled from the flames, imagining the men they might have become. Standing with a grunt, John limped to his kitchen, each step a reminder of years spent pounding the pavement. Case files were spread across the small table, old ones he'd kept, unsolved mysteries that still nagged at him like splinters in his mind. Force of habit made him review them sometimes, though he had no authority anymore. Just another retiree living off his pension, trying to make ends meet in a city that grew more expensive by the day. His phone sat next to the files, its screen dark and silent. Stephen's number was still on speed dial, right where it had always been. His thumb hovered over the button, trembling slightly. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe his son would actually want to talk. Maybe this time the distance between them wouldn't feel so vast. He put the phone down without dialing, his shoulders sagging with the familiar weight of regret. The bedroom wasn't much, but it was neat. Old habits died hard. The corners of the bed were tucked with military precision, the floor swept clean. John sat heavily on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking beneath him like old bones. A framed photo on the nightstand showed Stephen's high school graduation, his son's smile bright and hopeful. It felt like another lifetime before the arguments, before the silence, before everything fell apart. "Time for bed, old man," he told himself, lying down and pulling up his thin blanket. His knee ached, promising rain tomorrow, a more reliable weather forecast than any meteorologist. As his eyes grew heavy, his thoughts drifted back to that night 20 years ago, to the weight of two small bodies in his arms, so light, yet so precious, to the heat of the flames that had licked at his heels, to the way those boys had clung to him, trusting him completely, their tiny fingers gripping his uniform. Outside his window, the street lamp cast an orange glow through his blinds, painting stripes across his ceiling. The sound of an expensive engine purred below, unusual for this neighborhood where most cars rattled with age. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the streetlight like black ice. John's eyes closed, unaware of the vehicle's arrival, his breathing settling into the rhythm of sleep. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, just like it always did in this city of second chances. John stared at his microwave dinner, the plastic film still steaming as he peeled it back. Another lonely evening of processed food and stale memories. The fork had just pierced the rubbery chicken when 3 sharp knocks echoed through his apartment. The sound felt alien in the usual silence of his evening routine. He froze. Nobody ever visited him here. His son Stephen hadn't been by in years, and he'd lost touch with most of his old police buddies. The knocks came again, more insistent this time, making the thin walls vibrate slightly. Pushing himself up from his small kitchen table, his knee creaking in protest, John made his way to the door. Through the peephole, he saw 2 young black men in expensive suits standing in the hallway. They looked important, professional, definitely out of place in his rundown building. Their posture spoke of confidence and purpose, making him even more curious. John's cop instincts kicked in as he opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand near the drawer where he still kept his old service weapon. "Can I help you?" His voice came out gruffer than he'd intended, years of solitude having worn away his social graces. The slightly taller of the 2 men stepped forward, his presence commanding but not threatening. "Officer Callahan, we've been looking for you." His voice was deep, confident, with an undercurrent of something that made John pay closer attention. John's pulse slowed as he studied them. There was something familiar about their faces, but he couldn't place it. The second man offered a gentler smile, his eyes kind and patient, seeming to understand John's wariness. "May we come in?" the second man asked. "We have something important to discuss with you." His tone was softer, more measured than his brother's. Against his better judgment, John stepped aside, letting them enter his small apartment. The taller one glanced at the TV dinner cooling on the table, then back at John, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "I'm Micah Carter," he said, extending his hand. "And this is my brother, Malachi." His handshake was firm, purposeful. John shook their hands automatically, still trying to understand why they were here. They settled onto his worn couch while he lowered himself into his recliner, his knee protesting again. The springs squeaked beneath him, a familiar sound in the uncomfortable silence. "Officer Callahan," Malachi began, leaning forward slightly. 20 years ago, you ran into a burning building on South Ashland." His words were careful, measured, as if he knew the weight they carried. John's breath caught in his throat. The memory of that night, the smoke, the heat, the tiny cries, came rushing back. His hands began to tremble slightly as the past crashed into the present. "We were the babies you saved," Micah said simply, his eyes locked on John's face. John gripped the edge of his table, the room suddenly spinning. He stared at their faces, really looked at them now. Two tiny, soot-covered babies had become these accomplished young men sitting in his living room. The resemblance to those innocent faces he'd carried from the flames was there, hidden beneath years of growth and change. "It's been 20 years, Micah continued, a warm smile spreading across his face. "But we never forgot you." His words hung in the air, heavy with gratitude and purpose. John opened his mouth, but no words came out. All those nights wondering if he'd made a difference, all those years questioning if anything he'd done had mattered. And here was his answer, sitting right in front of him. The weight of 2 decades of doubt began to lift from his shoulders. The microwave dinner sat forgotten on the counter, as John stared at the 2 men standing in his doorway. His hand trembled slightly on the door frame, his mind struggling to make sense of their presence. The dim light from his apartment cast long shadows across their expensive suits and polished shoes, items that seemed out of place in his run-down building. Their matching dark ties and crisp white shirts made him painfully aware of his own threadbare t-shirt and worn jeans. "Please, may we come in?" Micah asked, his voice gentle but confident. John stepped back automatically, his police instincts scanning them even after all these years. They moved with grace into his small living room, their height and presence making the space feel even smaller. The floorboards creaked beneath their careful steps. "I'm sorry about the mess," John mumbled, quickly pushing aside some old newspapers from his worn armchair. His cheeks burned with embarrassment at the state of his apartment. The peeling wallpaper, the stack of unwashed dishes, the general air of defeat that hung over everything. A dusty photo frame lay face down on the side table, untouched for months. "We know this is unexpected," Micah continued, "but we had to find you." His words carried weight, purpose. He stood straight-backed, shoulders squared, radiating a quiet determination. John gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Find me? Who are you?" His heart hammered against his ribs, though he couldn't explain why. Malachi's smile was softer than his brother's, more hesitant. "We were just babies when you saved us from that fire. We're the twins." His voice held a gentleness that seemed to wrap around John like a warm blanket. The words hit John like a physical blow. He grabbed the table edge, steadying himself as 20-year-old memories crashed over him. The heat of the flames, the weight of 2 tiny bodies in his arms, the crack of falling beams behind him. The smell of smoke seemed to fill his nostrils again, making his chest tighten. You were just little boys," he managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. His fingers traced unconscious patterns on the table's worn surface. "And we spent the last 20 years searching for you," Micah said, taking a step forward. "It wasn't easy. The department records were incomplete, and then you retired." His eyes held a mix of determination and relief, like a man who'd finally completed a long journey, We're doctors now, Malachi added quietly. Both of us. At Chicago Memorial. He paused, his eyes meeting John's. The Carters, they adopted us when we were 3, gave us everything we could have wanted, but we never forgot about you. He touched his brother's arm lightly, a gesture of shared memory. John's throat felt tight. I tried to keep track of you. For a while. But the system... He trailed off, remembering the frustration of hitting dead ends, of being told it wasn't his business. The bitter taste of those rejections still lingered. We'd like to take you to dinner, Micah said. Tonight, if you're free. There's a restaurant downtown, the Capitol Grill. We have so much to tell you, so much to thank you for. His smile was warm, inviting, leaving no room for refusal. John looked down at his shabby clothes, then at his microwave dinner. The contrast between his life and theirs couldn't have been more stark. Part of him wanted to refuse, to protect what little pride he had left. The frozen meals packaging mocked him from the counter, a symbol of how far he'd fallen. But then he looked into their eyes, those same wide, trusting eyes he remembered from that terrible night, and found himself nodding. "All right," he said softly. "Let's talk." Something long dormant stirred in his chest, like a flower turning toward the sun after years in shadow. John's worn dress shoes clicked against the marble floor as he entered the grand ballroom. The borrowed suit felt stiff and uncomfortable, a constant reminder that he didn't belong in this world of crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. Classical music drifted through the air, mixing with the quiet murmur of Chicago's elite as they mingled in their designer clothes. He fought the urge to turn around and head straight back to his small apartment, where at least he knew his place. "Officer Callahan," Malachi's warm voice cut through his anxiety. The younger man stood by the entrance, his smile genuine and welcoming, dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit that made John's borrowed one feel even more out of place. "I'm so glad you came." John tugged at his collar, feeling the unfamiliar constraint of the tie. "Almost didn't," he admitted, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "This isn't really my scene." "Trust me," Malachi squeezed his shoulder, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that made John want to look away. "You belong here more than most." Before John could protest, the lights dimmed. Micah appeared on stage, commanding attention with an easy confidence that made John envious. The microphone crackled to life, the sound echoing through the elegant space. "Ladies and gentlemen," Micah's voice filled the room, strong and clear. "Tonight, we celebrate someone special, a man who gave us our first chance at life." John's stomach dropped, his palms growing sweaty. He hadn't expected this. On the giant screen behind Micah, images began to appear. The burning house, its windows glowing orange against the darkness. Smoke billowing into the night sky like angry clouds. Then a photo that made his breath catch. Himself, 20 years younger, carrying 2 tiny bundles through the flames, his face streaked with soot and determination. Gasps echoed through the crowd, followed by murmurs of amazement. John wanted to disappear into the floor, his face burning hotter than that long-ago fire. "Please," Micah's voice cracked with emotion, his usual confidence giving way to raw feeling. "Welcome our hero, Officer John Callahan." The room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, turning to face him with admiration in their eyes. John stood frozen until Malachi gently guided him forward with a steady hand on his back. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the stage, each step an effort against his instinct to flee. Malachi pressed something cool and heavy into his hands, a crystal award with his name engraved on it, the Lifesaver Recognition. The crystal caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across his hands. John tried to push it back, shaking his head, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't deserve—" he started, but Micah cut him off with a fierce hug that knocked the breath from his lungs. "You saved us, John," Micah whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Let us honor you. Please." The walls John had built over decades began to crack, letting in light he'd long denied himself. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes as he looked out at the standing ovation. For the first time in as long as he could remember, people saw him, really saw him. Not as a washed-up cop or a failed father, but as someone who had made a difference, who had changed lives for the better. Yet even as the applause washed over him like a warm wave, a familiar voice in his head whispered that he didn't deserve this recognition. That one good deed couldn't make up for all his failures. The missed birthdays, the broken promises, the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of his dedication to the job. He gripped the award tighter, trying to silence the doubt, but it lingered like an old friend, whispering of all the ways he'd fallen short. The winter wind bit through John's borrowed suit as he stood alone on the balcony, his hands gripping the cold metal railing until his knuckles turned white. Below him, Chicago's lights sparkled like fallen stars scattered across a dark canvas, but he felt disconnected from it all, from the warmth of the party behind him, from the celebration in his honor, from the love these two successful young men wanted so desperately to give him. "I don't belong here," he whispered to the night air, his breath forming small clouds that drifted away into nothingness, just like his dreams of family had years ago. The glass door slid open behind him with a soft whoosh. Quiet footsteps approached, and Malachi appeared at his side, his concerned face illuminated by the city lights that cast shadows across his young features. "Why are you out here?" Malachi asked gently, tugging his suit jacket closer against the cold. "Everyone's asking about you. They want to hear your story." John exhaled heavily, shaking his head as his shoulders slumped. "I was just doing my job that night. Nothing more. Any cop would have done the same." "No." Malachi's voice grew firm, taking on an edge John hadn't heard before. "You gave us life, a chance at everything we have today, the home we built, our careers, our future. It all exists because of you." "I couldn't even save my own family." John's voice came out hollow, broken like shattered glass. "My wife left. My son." He swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Stephen hasn't spoken to me in years. What kind of hero fails his own flesh and blood?" Understanding dawned in Malachi's eyes as he studied the older man's weathered face, noting every line etched by years of regret. "Is that what this is about? You think you don't deserve recognition because your family fell apart? I worked double shifts, missed birthdays, school plays." John's fingers tightened on the railing as memories flooded back, each one a fresh wound. "Always told myself I was doing it for them, protecting other people's families. But in the end, I lost everything that mattered, every single thing." "Officer Callahan, don't." John cut him off, his voice sharp with pain. "Don't try to make this better. You and Micah, you're good kids, successful, but I'm not the hero you think I am. I'm just..." His voice cracked like thin ice. "I'm just a failed cop who couldn't keep his own house in order, who lost everything trying to save everyone else." Malachi reached out to touch his arm, but John pulled away as if the contact might burn. The weight of 2 decades of guilt and regret pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe in the frigid air. The sounds of laughter and music from inside felt like mockery now, each note a reminder of his failures. "I should go," John muttered, turning away from the view and the memories it stirred. This was a mistake. All of it. "Please, just stay." Malachi started, his voice tinged with desperation, but John was already moving past him, shoulders hunched against invisible burdens. Through the glass doors, Micah watched his brother try to stop John, saw the deep pain etched on the older man's face like a mask he couldn't remove. He made no move to intervene as John hurried through the ballroom, head down, avoiding eye contact with the guests who had just minutes ago been applauding him as if he were some kind of savior. Micah knew as he watched John disappear through the exit like a shadow fleeing the light that the man wasn't ready. Not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, the guilt too deep, the pain too raw to accept the gratitude they wanted to give him. The afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through John's dusty blinds, casting long shadows across his small apartment. The award from last night sat on his scratched coffee table, its polished surface catching what little light made it through, making the brass gleam despite the dim room. John slumped in his worn armchair, his weathered fingers tracing the engraved letters. For outstanding heroism, Officer John Callahan. The medal felt cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the speeches and applause from the ceremony. His chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a weight on it. Images flashed through his mind, his ex-wife Sarah packing her bags, tears streaming down her face, mascara leaving dark trails on her cheeks. "I can't do this anymore, John. The late nights, never knowing if you'll come home." Her voice echoed in his memory, cracking with emotion, just as it had that day. Then Stephen, his son, growing from a bright-eyed boy who wanted to be just like his dad, into a teenager who wouldn't even look at him. Birthday parties missed, baseball games forgotten, school plays where his seat remained empty. The disappointment in Stephen's eyes had grown deeper with each absence until it hardened into something worse: indifference. 20 years of loneliness stretched between then and now, each day blending into the next, until time became just something that happened to other people. The walls of his apartment had become both his shelter and his prison, decorated with nothing but regrets and what-ifs. A sharp knock jolted him from his thoughts. John ignored it, his eyes fixed on the award. Another knock, more insistent this time. Then another, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. "Go away," he muttered, but the knocking continued, steady and determined. Finally, with a deep sigh, he pushed himself up and shuffled to the door, his joints protesting the movement. When he opened it, Micah and Malachi stood there, determination written across their faces, looking fresh and purposeful in their work clothes. "We're not letting you push us away," Micah said firmly, stepping past John into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. His polished shoes clicked against the worn linoleum floor. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but—" John started, his voice rough from disuse. "No," Malachi cut him off, his voice gentle but firm as he followed his brother inside. "You're not alone anymore, John, whether you like it or not." John ran a hand through his gray hair, feeling the coarse strands between his fingers. "You don't understand. I'm not the hero you think I am. I couldn't even keep my own family together." "That doesn't make you any less worthy," Micah insisted, standing tall in his crisp suit, every inch the successful businessman he'd become. "Come to dinner with us. One night. No excuses." John rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache building behind his eyes. These two wouldn't take no for an answer. He could see it in their eyes. The same determination he'd once had, back when he still believed in himself, back when his badge meant something more than just memories. "Fine," he conceded, the word coming out like a sigh. "One dinner." A smile spread across Micah's face as he patted John's shoulder, the touch warm and reassuring. "See you at 7. John watched them leave, shaking his head slowly. These boys, these men, weren't giving up on him, even though he'd given up on himself long ago. Their footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more, but somehow the apartment felt a little less empty than before. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the white tablecloth as John Callahan shifted uncomfortably in his seat at Lorenzo's, one of Chicago's finest restaurants. His borrowed suit felt tight around his neck, and he couldn't help but feel out of place among the well-dressed diners and crystal wine glasses. The quiet murmur of elegant conversation and the gentle clink of silverware only heightened his sense of not belonging. Across from him sat Micah and Malachi Carter, both looking perfectly at ease in their tailored suits. The twins carried themselves with a quiet confidence that spoke of their success, yet their eyes held a warmth that made John's chest ache. They looked so grown up now, so far removed from the terrified children he'd pulled from that burning building all those years ago. Micah lifted his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. "To second chances," he said, his voice carrying a note of hope. The crystal sparkled under the intimate lighting, making the moment feel almost surreal. John hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he raised his own glass. The crystal felt foreign in his calloused fingers, a stark reminder of how far he'd fallen from his days as a respected officer. "We know you feel like you don't deserve any of this," Malachi said softly, his eyes kind. "But we're not here because we have to be. We're here because we want to be." His gentle tone carried the same reassuring quality it had when he was just a child comforting his brother. John exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple with work-worn fingers. "I just don't understand why you care so much." The words came out rough, almost desperate. Micah leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because you didn't leave us to die. You gave us a future." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The twins took turns sharing their story. They spoke of their adoptive parents, wealthy doctors who provided everything money could buy but struggled to show real affection. Micah described their determination to become doctors themselves, fighting through prejudice and doubt. Their voices carried equal measures of gratitude and determination as they recounted their journey. "We had everything we needed," Malachi admitted, stirring his coffee. The spoon made soft circles against the porcelain cup. "But something was always missing. Then we learned about you, about what you did that night." His words were carefully chosen, each one weighted with purpose. John's grip tightened on his fork until his knuckles turned white. He stared down at his barely touched steak, fighting the emotion rising in his throat. The perfectly cooked meal before him might as well have been cardboard for all he tasted it. Micah reached into his jacket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the pristine tablecloth. "This is for you." His fingers lingered on the envelope for a moment before withdrawing. John's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were papers for a house, a real house in a good neighborhood. His eyes widened at the price listed. The numbers seemed to swim before his eyes, more money than he'd seen in years. "I can't accept this," he said hoarsely, trying to push the envelope back. "I don't deserve it." His voice cracked on the last word. Micah's response was quiet but firm. "You saved our lives. Now let us give you one." The sincerity in his eyes made it impossible for John to look away. John sat there, the weight of their offer pressing down on him. After what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath. "Let me think about it." The words cost him, but they were honest. The twins exchanged glances, small smiles playing at their lips. For the first time since they'd found him, John wasn't pushing them away completely. In the warm glow of the restaurant, something shifted between them. A tiny crack in the wall John had built around himself, letting in the first ray of hope. The harsh ring of John's phone cut through his morning silence like a knife. He fumbled for it on his nightstand, nearly knocking over his half-empty glass of water, his head still fuzzy from sleep. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in years, Detective Mark Connolly. "Turn on the news, Callahan," Connolly's gruff voice commanded without greeting. There was an edge to his tone that John couldn't quite place. John grabbed his remote with shaking hands and clicked on the small TV in the corner of his bedroom, the one he usually only turned on for weather reports and baseball games. A perfectly coiffed news anchor sat behind a desk, her expression earnest as she spoke, hands clasped professionally in front of her. In a remarkable story of heroism and reunion, former Chicago police officer John Callahan has been found by the twin boys he saved from a burning building 20 years ago, she announced, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned reporter. John's breath caught in his throat as images filled the screen. There he was, younger and stronger, carrying 2 tiny bundles through smoke and flames. His old uniform was covered in soot, his face determined beneath the grime. Then footage from the gala, showing Micah and Malachi presenting him with the award, their faces beaming with gratitude and joy. His phone buzzed again, and again. Names he hadn't seen in years lit up his screen. Officer Martinez, Sergeant Thompson, even Captain Briggs. Each message expressed surprise, congratulations, and subtle hints of regret for not staying in touch. Some asked why he'd disappeared, others simply wanted to reconnect. Then a text from his ex-wife, Sarah. "Just saw you on the news. You look good, John." The words made his stomach twist with old memories. He sat on the edge of his bed, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, running his fingers through his gray-streaked hair. The news anchor continued. Officer Callahan's heroic actions that night saved the lives of Micah and Malachi Carter, who have grown up to become successful doctors. His phone rang again. This time it was Micah. "John!" Micah's voice was filled with laughter and excitement. "You're all over the morning news. Channel 5, Channel 7, they're all running the story." "We didn't plan this," Malachi chimed in from the background, his voice softer but equally pleased. "But you deserve the recognition. Everyone should know what you did." "I never wanted," John started, his voice rough with emotion, but Micah cut him off. We know, you never wanted attention, but maybe it's time you accepted that you did something extraordinary. You changed lives, John. Our lives." John watched as more footage played across his screen. Old photos of him in uniform, standing proud next to his patrol car, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. He barely recognized that younger version of himself, so full of purpose and determination, before the weight of his choices had bent his shoulders. His phone buzzed with another notification, a voicemail. The name made his heart stop. Stephen Callahan. His son's message was brief but clear. "Dad, we need to talk." The voice was deeper than John remembered, more mature, but still unmistakably Stephen's. John stared at his phone, his hand trembling slightly. After years of silence, after countless unanswered calls and hollow holidays, after birthdays marked only by cards that may or may not have been read, his son wanted to talk. The words seemed to pulse on his screen, full of possibility and terror all at once. He sank back onto his bed, the springs creaking beneath him, the news still playing in the background, his phone still buzzing with messages. For so long he'd lived in shadows, convinced he deserved the loneliness. But now, with each ring of his phone, each message of congratulation, each image of his younger self doing what he knew was right, something shifted inside him, like a door long rusted shut finally creaking open. His fingers hovered over Stephen's number, his heart pounding in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he had something worth fighting for again. Maybe this time, he wouldn't have to face the flames alone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe's dusty windows as John sat in a corner booth, his coffee growing cold. His weathered hands wouldn't stop shaking, so he gripped the mug tighter, feeling the smooth ceramic beneath his calloused fingers. Every time the bell above the door chimed, his heart jumped and his stomach twisted into knots. Then he saw him. Stephen. His son walked in, tall and straight-backed, wearing a crisp charcoal business suit that spoke of success. John's breath caught in his throat. It was like looking in a mirror from 20 years ago. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, even the way he carried himself. But Stephen's face was hard, his shoulders tense with years of built-up resentment that radiated from him like a physical force. John stood awkwardly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor as Stephen approached. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. Stephen just slid into the booth across from him, his movements careful and controlled like a man defusing a bomb. The silence stretched between them like a wall, thick with unspoken words and missed opportunities. John cleared his throat, his voice rougher than he intended, scratching like sandpaper. "Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Stephen crossed his arms, his golden wedding ring catching the light. His fingers drummed once against his sleeve. "I saw the news. Guess you're a hero now." John stared down at his coffee, watching his distorted reflection in the dark liquid. "I'm no hero." "You never tried to be my hero." Stephen's words weren't angry, just matter of fact, which somehow hurt more than if he'd shouted them across the table. John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every missed birthday, every empty chair at graduation, every broken promise that had piled up over the years. "I know." The waitress stopped by, her pen poised over her notepad, and Stephen ordered black coffee. More silence followed, broken only by the clink of ceramic on the table when his drink arrived and the distant murmur of other customers. Then Stephen said something that made John's head snap up. "Maybe we can change that." John blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly, his heart skipping a beat. Stephen took a slow sip of his coffee before continuing, his fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "Those twins at the gala, I saw their speech. They talked about you like you were something special. I just did my job that night, John mumbled, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Did you? Stephen's voice was quiet, thoughtful. Because they said you ran into a burning building when everyone told you not to. That sounds like the same stubborn dad I remember. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, softening his features for just a moment. John felt his throat tighten, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Stephen, I know I messed up. With you. With your mom. Yeah, you did. Stephen cut him off, but his voice had lost some of its edge, like a knife slowly being sheathed. But maybe we can try to fix things. Small steps. They agreed to meet again next week. Same place, same time. No promises, no grand gestures, just two men trying to find their way back to being father and son, to bridge a gap that had seemed uncrossable for so long. When Stephen stood to leave, John watched him go, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. His coffee was stone cold now, but he barely noticed. For the first time in years, he felt hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, but undeniably real. John stood at the front door of Micah and Malachi's elegant home, his hand frozen mid-knock. Through the frosted glass, he could see the warm glow of Christmas lights and shadows of people moving inside. The sound of laughter drifted through the door, making his stomach tighten. He hadn't celebrated Christmas properly in years, usually just a TV dinner and old movies. Before he could retreat, the door swung open. Micah stood there in a festive sweater, grinning broadly. Were you planning on standing out there all night? I was just... John stammered, but Micah grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. Come on, old man. You're part of this family now. Micah's voice was warm but firm, leaving no room for argument. The interior of the house took John's breath away. A massive Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, decorated with golden ornaments and twinkling lights. Garlands wrapped around the staircase, and the air smelled of cinnamon and roasting turkey. Malachi appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron. John, perfect timing. Dinner's almost ready. People filled the living room, doctors, nurses, and other professionals who worked with the twins. Each one greeted John with genuine warmth, many sharing stories about how Micah and Malachi had spoken about him over the years. The famous Officer Callahan, one woman said, squeezing his hand. We've heard so much about you. John felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of acceptance. Then came another knock at the door. Micah opened it and John's heart stopped. Stephen stood there looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. Stephen? John's voice cracked. His son shrugged, hands in his pockets. Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about. He glanced around the room, taking in the scene. Nice place. Micah and Malachi exchanged surprised looks before Micah stepped forward, extending his hand. Welcome. You must be Stephen. We've heard about you. Stephen shook Micah's hand firmly, nodding. There was an understanding in that handshake, two men acknowledging their shared connection to John. Malachi announced dinner was ready, and everyone moved to the dining room. The table was set beautifully, candles flickering among holiday decorations. John found himself at the head of the table, carving knife in hand. As he looked around at the faces, Micah and Malachi beaming with pride, Stephen sitting quietly but present, the room full of warmth and acceptance, John felt a lump form in his throat. His hands trembled slightly as he carved the turkey. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone on Christmas Eve. For the first time ever, he truly felt like he belonged. The room filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, passing plates, and genuine laughter. John caught Stephen's eye across the table, and his son gave him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. The warm glow of the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the living room as Christmas music played softly in the background. John sat on the plush leather couch, his posture more relaxed than it had been in years. He watched as Micah told an animated story that had both Malachi and Stephen doubled over with laughter. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, and the remnants of their feast, empty plates and half-filled glasses, cluttered the coffee table. Here, Micah said, walking over to John with a small, carefully wrapped package. "This one's for you." John's hands felt clumsy as he took the gift. He couldn't remember the last time someone had given him a Christmas present. Carefully, he peeled back the wrapping paper, aware of the others watching him. Inside was a simple wooden frame, but what it contained made his breath catch. The newspaper clipping was yellowed with age, but the words were still clear. "Hero cop saves twin boys from burning building." Below the article was a handwritten note in elegant script. "Because of you, we are here." John stared at it, his vision blurring slightly. I don't know what to say." His voice came out rougher than he intended. Malachi's gentle smile warmed the room even more. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that it mattered." The couch dipped as Stephen sat down next to him. John tensed slightly, still unused to his son's presence after so many years of distance. But Stephen's voice held none of its usual edge when he spoke. "You never did this kind of Christmas when I was a kid?" There was no accusation in the words, just a quiet observation. John's shoulders hunched as shame washed over him. All those missed Christmases, all those years he'd buried himself in work instead of being there for his family. But Stephen surprised him by nudging his shoulder. "We still have time." The simple words nearly undid him. John nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat as tears threatened to spill. He needed a moment to compose himself. Rising from the couch, he stepped out onto the back porch, the cold December air sharp in his lungs. Above him, stars dotted the clear night sky. He pulled out the framed article, his fingers tracing over the faded newsprint. "You weren't just saving them," he whispered to himself. "They were saving you." The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of John's apartment, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Cardboard boxes were scattered everywhere, some already sealed with packing tape, others still waiting to be filled. John stood in the middle of his bedroom, a drawer pulled open before him. Micah carried another empty box through the doorway. "Almost done in here?" he asked, setting it down with a soft thud. John didn't answer immediately. His weathered hands trembled as he lifted out a thick bundle of envelopes, held together with a rubber band. The letters were yellowed with age, but the addresses were still clear. All from Stephen, spanning years he'd rather forget. "Those look important," Malachi said quietly, appearing behind his brother. His keen eyes took in John's rigid posture, the slight shake in his hands. John swallowed hard. Letters from Stephen, never opened them. He placed them carefully on the scratched kitchen table like they might crumble at any moment. Couldn't face it back then. "You gonna read them?" Malachi asked gently, no judgment in his voice. John ran a hand through his gray hair, exhaling slowly. "Not yet, but soon." The words felt heavy, but honest. "Need to be ready first." Micah stepped forward, placing a strong hand on John's shoulder. "One step at a time, old man." His voice was warm, supportive. "No rush." They worked in comfortable silence after that, methodically emptying drawers and closets. Each item seemed to carry the weight of John's solitary years. Old takeout menus, unpaid bills, forgotten photographs pushed to the back of drawers. 20 years of isolation packed away in cardboard boxes. As the morning wore on, the apartment began to echo with emptiness. The walls, already stark, seemed especially bare now. John found himself standing in the middle of his living room, turning slowly. Without his belongings, the place felt smaller somehow, colder. He realized with sudden clarity that it had never really been a home, just a place to hide. Micah appeared in the doorway, keys jingling in his hand. "Last box is loaded up." He studied John's face carefully. "You ready?" John took one final look around, his eyes lingering on the spot where he'd sat alone for so many Christmas mornings, where he'd eaten countless microwave dinners, where he'd convinced himself he deserved nothing better. With steady steps, he walked to the door. The key felt heavy in his hand as he locked it one final time. The click of the lock was oddly final, like closing a chapter of a book. As they walked down the creaking stairs, John felt lighter with each step. Micah and Malachi flanked him protectively, as if worried he might change his mind. But John didn't look back. He slid into the passenger seat of Micah's car, watching through the side mirror as his old apartment building grew smaller and smaller. The bundle of Stephen's letters sat in his lap, no longer a weight of guilt, but a promise of possibility. John exhaled slowly, feeling the tension of 2 decades begin to loosen its grip on his shoulders. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was ready for something new. The cafe buzzed with quiet afternoon chatter as John sat at a corner table, watching snowflakes drift past the foggy window. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he checked his watch for the 5th time. The familiar knot in his stomach tightened as he recognized Stephen's figure approaching through the snow. The bell above the door chimed and Stephen stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. He looked so much like John had at that age. Same strong jaw, same determined walk. But his eyes held a wariness that made John's heart ache. "Hey, son," John said, half rising from his seat. Stephen gave a slight nod and settled into the chair across from him. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." John sank back down, wrapping his hands around his cold coffee mug. "I almost didn't," he admitted, "but I didn't want to waste any more time." A waitress approached and Stephen ordered a coffee. The silence stretched between them until she returned with his drink. Stephen stirred his coffee slowly, not meeting John's eyes. "So, tell me about them. The twins." John took a deep breath. "Micah and Malachi, they're doctors now, both of them, smart kids, good hearts." He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "Malachi's the quiet one, always watching, thinking. Micah's more direct. Reminds me a bit of you, actually." Stephen's spoon clinked against his cup. "How'd they find you?" "They hired someone, spent years looking." John shook his head. "I never thought... they were just babies when I pulled them out." "Must be nice," Stephen said softly, "having someone look for you like that." The words hit John like a physical blow. He set his cup down carefully. "Stephen, I'm sorry. Not just for being gone so much when you were growing up, but for never trying harder to fix things. I convinced myself you were better off without me." Stephen's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your choice to make." "No," John agreed. "It wasn't. I was wrong." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the snow fall outside. Finally, Stephen pushed his chair back. "I should go." John's heart sank, but he nodded. He'd expected this. Stephen stood buttoning his coat, but instead of leaving immediately, he hesitated. Maybe we can try, to talk sometimes." John looked up, hardly daring to breathe. "I'd like that." Stephen gave another short nod and turned toward the door. John watched him go, feeling lighter than he had in years. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. The familiar smell of stale coffee and paper files hit John as he walked through the doors of Chicago PD headquarters. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, each step bringing back memories, some good, some painful. The building hadn't changed much, but he had. Micah and Malachi flanked him, their presence giving him strength he didn't know he needed. The twins wore matching dark suits, looking more at home in these halls than John felt after all these years. "You okay?" Malachi asked quietly. John nodded, tugging at his tie. "Just strange being back here." The conference hall doors opened to reveal rows of uniformed officers, some faces he recognized, weathered by time like his own. Others were young, fresh-faced rookies who reminded him of himself decades ago. At the front, Detective Mark Connolly stood at the podium, looking uncomfortable in his dress blues. When John entered, heads turned. The room fell silent. He saw Captain Briggs in the corner, older now, but still carrying that same stern expression. Their eyes met briefly, and Briggs gave a slight nod. Connolly cleared his throat into the microphone. "Today we recognize a man who did what many of us couldn't, a man who saw 2 lives worth saving when others saw statistics." John's chest tightened as he remembered that night. The flames, the smoke, those tiny cries in the darkness. He felt Micah's hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the present. The police commissioner stepped forward holding a gleaming plaque. "For a lifetime of service and sacrifice," he read, handing it to John. Standing at the podium, John's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the microphone. The faces before him blurred as he found his voice. "I used to think this job took everything from me, but I realize now, it gave me something too." The applause started slowly, then built into a thunderous standing ovation. Officers he hadn't seen in years approached him, shaking his hand, some with tears in their eyes. Even those who had once turned their backs now looked at him with respect. Connolly was the last to approach. "I was wrong back then," he said quietly. "About everything." When the ceremony ended, John stepped outside into the crisp winter air. The plaque felt heavy in his hands, but his heart felt lighter. 20 years of doubt and regret seemed to lift from his shoulders. Micah appeared beside him, that familiar smirk on his face. "Not bad for an old cop." John laughed, shaking his head. "Not bad at all." The Chicago PD auditorium buzzed with quiet conversation as people filed in, filling the rows of seats. John stood in a side hallway, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. The suit felt stiff and foreign on his shoulders. "You clean up nice," Micah said, appearing beside him with a grin. John managed a weak smile. "Still not sure I belong here." "You've always belonged here," Malachi added softly. "They just took too long to see it." Through the doorway, John could see Detective Mark Connolly shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Their eyes met briefly before Connolly looked away. The same man who'd mocked him 20 years ago for saving 2 black kids now sat waiting to honor him. Police Commissioner Greg Stanton stepped up to the podium, his voice filling the hall. "Tonight we correct a mistake. 20 years ago, a man risked his life to save 2 children when others might have turned away." The crowd erupted in applause. John's heart hammered against his ribs as he heard his name called. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward the stage, each step echoing in his ears. He glanced at the front row where Micah and Malachi beamed with pride. Then he saw him, Stephen, standing in the back, arms crossed but watching intently. His son had actually come. John's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of faces. "For years I believed I was forgotten," John began, his voice rough with emotion. "But tonight, I see that doing the right thing is never truly lost." His eyes found Stephen again, and his son gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The weight of 20 years seemed to lift from John's shoulders as he stepped down from the stage. Micah and Malachi immediately enveloped him in a warm embrace. "About time they recognized you, old man," Micah said, his voice thick with emotion. John exhaled deeply, feeling the tension drain from his body. For the first time in decades, he felt truly seen, not just as a cop who'd made a rescue, but as a man who'd chosen to do what was right when it mattered most. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of John's new guest house, casting warm shadows across freshly painted walls. The space was modest but elegant, a far cry from his cramped apartment. Boxes were scattered around, waiting to be unpacked, while the smell of fresh paint and new furniture filled the air. "Watch your back, old man," Micah called out, maneuvering a box through the doorway. His suit jacket was off, sleeves rolled up as he worked. Malachi knelt on the floor, surrounded by pieces of what would eventually be a coffee table. "I swear these instructions are in another language," he muttered, squinting at the paper. John stood in the middle of the living room, taking it all in. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances. The shelves were solid oak. Everything spoke of quality and care, things he wasn't used to having. "Earth to John," Micah said, tossing him a house key. The metal caught the sunlight as John caught it. "You belong here. No more hiding in that dump you called an apartment." Malachi looked up from his project, smirking. "Now you have no excuse to skip family dinner. We're literally 30 steps away." John turned the key over in his hand, feeling its weight. This wasn't some handout or pity project. The twins had thought everything through, from the location to the size to the furniture. They wanted him close. "I don't know what to say," John admitted, his voice rough. "Then don't say anything," Micah replied, opening another box. "Just help me unpack these pictures." Together, they began placing John's old photographs around the house. His police academy graduation, his first day on the force, even a few rare shots with Stephen from years ago. Each memory found its new home. The framed newspaper article, the one about the fire, took center stage on the mantel. "Perfect spot," Malachi said, stepping back to admire it. Soon, delicious smells wafted from the kitchen as the twins took over, cooking dinner like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Pots clanked, spices were sprinkled, and laughter filled the space. "Hope you like pasta," Micah called out. "It's about all we know how to make." "That's not true," Malachi corrected. "We also make excellent takeout phone calls." John sat at his new kitchen table, watching them move around his space with such ease. They weren't guests, they were family. The realization hit him suddenly, warming him more than any house ever could. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed naturally. Stories about their medical practices, jokes about Malachi's furniture assembly skills, plans for future family dinners. John leaned back in his chair, taking in the scene before him. For the first time in decades, he felt truly content. "You're awfully quiet over there," Micah noted, passing the garlic bread. "Just thinking," John replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "Dangerous hobby," Malachi teased. The twins continued their playful banter, filling the house with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. John's key sat on the counter, catching the late afternoon light. A simple symbol of belonging, of family, of future. The morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges as John sat on his front porch, steam rising from his coffee mug. These quiet moments had become his favorite part of the day. A time to breathe, to reflect, to simply exist without the weight of the past pressing down on him. He watched a pair of cardinals hop across his lawn, their bright red feathers stark against the dewy grass. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of spring, and somewhere in the distance, birds were welcoming the day with their cheerful songs. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of quick footsteps. John looked up to see Micah practically bouncing up the path to his porch, clutching an envelope in his hand. Despite wearing one of his usual expensive suits, Micah's excitement made him look younger, almost boyish. "Morning, old man," Micah grinned, holding out the envelope. "Open it." John set down his coffee and took the envelope, noting the thick, cream-colored paper. His weathered fingers carefully broke the seal and pulled out the card inside. As he unfolded it, his eyes widened, scanning the elegant script. "You're getting married?" John's voice was soft with surprise. Micah's smile grew even wider. "Yeah, Sarah and I set the date for June." He paused, watching John's face carefully. "But that's not all. I want you to be my best man." John's breath caught in his throat. The invitation trembled slightly in his hands as he looked up at Micah, searching for any sign of doubt or obligation in the young man's face. He found none. "Micah, there must be someone else. Someone more qualified." "You're the closest thing I have to a father," Micah cut him off, his voice firm but gentle. "There's no one more qualified." Before John could protest further, Malachi appeared on the porch already smirking. He was dressed more casually than his brother, hands in his pockets as he leaned against the railing. "Just say yes, old man," Malachi chuckled. "He's not going to take no for an answer." John shook his head, a laugh escaping despite himself. He looked at the invitation again, then at these two young men who had somehow become his family. His chest felt warm, full of something he hadn't felt in years. "All right," he finally nodded. "Best man it is." Micah's face lit up and he clapped John on the shoulder. "Just don't mess up the speech." John smiled, feeling the weight of this new responsibility, not as a burden, but as a gift. Something precious and unexpected, like everything else these boys had brought into his life. The California sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as guests settled into their seats at the outdoor wedding venue. White roses and delicate fairy lights decorated the elegant space, creating a magical atmosphere. John stood at the altar beside Micah, fidgeting with his tie for the 100th time. "Stop fussing," Micah whispered, grinning. "You look fine." John's hands dropped to his sides. He couldn't help but smile at Micah's nervous energy. The young man practically vibrated with excitement, shifting from foot to foot as he waited for his bride. Malachi stood nearby watching the scene with an amused expression. From his position, John could see Stephen sitting in the third row. Their eyes met briefly, and Stephen gave a small nod. The gesture, though simple, meant everything. The music swelled and everyone rose as the bride appeared. John watched Micah's face transform with pure joy. During the ceremony, John felt his chest tighten with emotion as the couple exchanged their vows. He never imagined he'd be standing here, part of something so beautiful, so meaningful. At the reception, crystal glasses clinked as John stood to deliver his speech. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd fell silent, waiting. 20 years ago, John began, his voice rough with emotion. I walked into a burning building and found 2 babies. I thought I was just doing my job. He paused, looking at Micah and Malachi. But Micah and Malachi don't owe me anything, yet somehow they've given me everything. The crowd erupted in applause as Micah wiped tears from his eyes. John caught sight of Stephen making his way through the crowd. His son approached slowly, hands in his pockets. That was a good speech, Dad, Stephen said quietly. John's heart raced. The moment felt fragile, precious. He took a deep breath and spoke the words he'd held back for so long. I love you, son. Stephen exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. I love you too, Dad. The reception continued around them, filled with laughter and music. John watched as Micah twirled his bride on the dance floor, as Malachi charmed the elderly relatives, as Stephen chatted with other guests. The night sparkled with joy and possibility. As the evening drew to a close, guests lined up to send off the happy couple. John stood with pride, watching Micah and his bride make their way through the shower of rose petals. Looking around at the faces of those he loved, his sons, both biological and chosen, John felt complete. This, he realized, was what life was truly about. The evening sun cast long shadows across John's front porch as he settled into his favorite rocking chair. The warm June air carried the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from Micah and Malachi's backyard BBQ. The scent of grilled burgers wafted over, making him smile. John took a long sip of his iced tea, ice cubes clinking against the glass. A year ago, he'd been alone in that cramped apartment, drowning in regret and isolation. Now, he had a family again. The sound of Micah's booming laugh echoed across the yard, followed by Malachi's quieter chuckle. His phone buzzed on the side table, screen lighting up with an unknown number. John hesitated, then picked it up. Hello? Mr. Callahan? A woman's voice, professional but urgent. This is Sandra from Mercy General Hospital. It's your son. John's hand tightened around the phone. What happened? There was an accident, a car crash. He's in critical condition. The world seemed to tilt sideways. John gripped the armrest of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs. Not Stephen. Not now. Not when they were finally finding their way back to each other. He stumbled to his feet, nearly knocking over his glass. Keys. He needed his keys. Where were his keys? John? Malachi's voice came from the yard. He must have seen John's sudden movement. What's wrong? John turned, his voice barely more than a rasp. It's Stephen. The drive to the hospital was a blur. John's hands gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline as memories flooded his mind. Stephen's first steps, his high school graduation that John had missed. Their coffee shop meeting just months ago, tentatively rebuilding what they'd lost. Please, John whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. Please, don't take him. The emergency room's automatic doors whooshed open as John rushed inside. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the evening darkness. A nurse in blue scrubs approached him, her face serious. Mr. Callahan, your son is in surgery now. John's legs felt weak. He found the nearest chair in the waiting room and sank into it, staring at the sterile white walls. Fear gripped his chest. Real, raw fear unlike anything he'd felt in years. Not even that burning building had scared him this much. He sat there, hands clasped tightly together, watching the seconds tick by on the wall clock, each moment an eternity of uncertainty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital waiting room, casting a harsh glow that made everything look washed out and cold. John sat slumped in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands clasped so tightly his fingers were starting to go numb. The antiseptic smell burned his nostrils, mixing with the lingering scent of cheap coffee from a nearby vending machine. Every time the double doors swung open, John's head snapped up, hoping for news. But each time, it was just another nurse or doctor rushing past, barely sparing him a glance. The squeak of rubber soles on linoleum made him look up again. This time, he saw Micah and Malachi hurrying toward him, their faces etched with concern. They'd clearly rushed over. Micah's tie was loose, and Malachi still wore his cooking apron. "How is he?" Micah asked, slightly out of breath. John rubbed his face with trembling hands, the weight of hours of waiting evident in his movements. "Still in surgery." Malachi settled into the chair beside him while Micah paced, unable to stay still. The minutes ticked by like hours until finally, the doors swung open again. A woman in surgical scrubs stepped out, removing her cap. Her face was tired but composed. "Mr. Callahan?" John stood up so quickly he felt dizzy. "Yes?" Dr. Carter approached them, her expression serious but not grave. "Stephen suffered severe internal bleeding. We did everything we could." John's fingers dug into the plastic armrest of the chair behind him, his legs weak. "Is he?" Dr. Carter's face softened slightly as she gave a small nod. "He's stable, but it's going to be a long recovery." The relief hit John like a physical force. His legs nearly gave out, but Micah and Malachi were there instantly, their hands steady on his shoulders, keeping him upright. "When can I see him?" John's voice was hoarse. "He needs rest right now," a nurse explained gently. "But Dr. Carter will let you know as soon as he's ready for visitors." "I'm not leaving," John said firmly, settling back into his chair. Dr. Carter nodded understanding. "He should wake up in a few hours. I'll have the nurses bring you some coffee." The night stretched on endlessly. Micah and Malachi refused to leave, taking turns getting coffee and keeping John company. Finally, as dawn approached, a nurse led them to Stephen's room. John's breath caught at the sight of his son. Stephen lay still, connected to various machines that beeped steadily. Bruises marked his face, and bandages wrapped around his chest were visible above the hospital gown. John sank into the chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of Stephen's chest. Each breath was a reminder that his son was still here, still fighting. "You're not getting rid of me that easily, kid," he muttered, settling in for the long wait ahead. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a gentle glow across Stephen's room. The steady beeping of machines had become a familiar rhythm over the past week, almost comforting in its consistency. John sat in what had become his designated chair, the cushion permanently molded to his shape after countless hours of vigil. A fresh bouquet of flowers brightened the windowsill, replacing the wilted ones from yesterday. Micah and Malachi stood near the door, their presence bringing warmth to the sterile environment. They'd been taking turns bringing John fresh clothes and making sure he ate something other than vending machine snacks. Stephen stirred slightly, his fingers twitching against the white hospital sheets. John immediately leaned forward, his tired eyes fixed on his son's face. After several moments, Stephen's eyes fluttered open, still clouded with medication. "Dad?" His voice was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse. John shifted closer, his hand hovering uncertainly before settling on the bed rail. "Yeah, kid. I'm here." Stephen's eyes focused slowly on John's face. A weak smile tugged at his lips. "You look like hell." John couldn't help but chuckle, running a hand over his unshaven face. "Right back at you." The room fell quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Stephen's gaze drifted around the room before settling back on his father. His next words came out soft and vulnerable. "I thought I'd wake up alone." John's throat tightened. He reached out and gripped Stephen's hand, his voice thick with emotion. Never again. From the doorway, Micah cleared his throat. Hey, Sleeping Beauty's finally awake. Malachi elbowed his brother. Give them a minute, would you? Stephen's eyes shifted to the twins and his smile grew slightly. The dynamic duo's here too? Yeah, someone's got to keep your old man from living on hospital coffee, Micah said, approaching the bed. Though I think he's developed a taste for it. It's growing on me, John admitted, not taking his eyes off Stephen. Stephen's expression grew serious. Dad, I was scared. I thought maybe it was too late for us. John tightened his grip on Stephen's hand. It's never too late. I promise you, I'm going to make up for lost time. We've got your back, Malachi added softly. Both of you. Stephen looked at his father, eyes glistening slightly. Maybe we can try again. John nodded, not bothering to hide the moisture in his own eyes. We will. John fidgeted in the plush leather chair, feeling out of place among the sleek furnishings of the publisher's office. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the bustling Chicago streets 20 floors below. Rachel Bennett's office walls were lined with bestsellers, their glossy spines catching the afternoon light. Micah and Malachi sat on either side of him, both wearing encouraging smiles. They'd orchestrated this meeting, convinced that John's story needed to be shared with the world. Rachel Bennett leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Your story is inspiring, John. We want to publish it. Her voice held genuine enthusiasm, but John couldn't help shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know, I'm no writer, he muttered, his calloused hands clasped tightly in his lap. The idea of putting his life on display made his stomach churn. Micah nudged him gently. You don't have to be. Just tell the truth. His voice was soft but firm, the same tone he used when convincing difficult patients to take their medicine. Rachel nodded, spreading out some papers on her desk. People need to hear what you did, how one choice changed everything. She pulled out a formal-looking document. We have an excellent ghostwriter who can help capture your voice. John stared at the proposal in front of him. The working title read, Through the Flames, A Story of Redemption. His throat felt tight. I never wanted attention for what I did, he said quietly. It was just my job. Malachi placed a hand on his shoulder. This isn't about fame, John. Think about all the people who might need to hear this story. About second chances. About family. Rachel slid the contract closer. We'll do it right, John. Your story, your way. John picked up the pen, its weight feeling significant in his hand. After a long moment, he signed his name. The ink seemed to gleam under the office lights. As they walked out of the building, Micah couldn't contain his grin. You're gonna be famous, old man. John laughed, shaking his head. As long as they spell my name right. The late summer sun warmed their faces as they stepped onto the busy sidewalk, just 3 men among the crowd, but bound by something stronger than blood. The bookstore buzzed with excitement, its usual quiet atmosphere transformed by the crowd that filled every available space. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the eager faces of readers clutching copies of A Second Chance, The Story of Officer John Callahan. The book's cover featured a striking image of the burning house from that fateful night, alongside a recent photo of John with Micah and Malachi. John sat at the signing table, his weathered hands fidgeting with a pen. Despite his pressed shirt and newly trimmed hair, he felt exposed under the bright lights and watchful eyes. Micah and Malachi stood beside him like proud sons, their presence both comforting and surreal. Rachel Bennett, dressed in a sharp business suit, leaned down beside him. You nervous? John released a shaky breath, his voice low. I was a cop for 30 years, but this is terrifying. Micah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. People are here because your story matters. The first person in line stepped forward. a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. She clutched the book to her chest before placing it gently on the table. "My son grew up in foster care," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Your story. It gives me hope." John reached out and gripped her hand, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "Thank you for saying that." As the line moved forward, each person shared their own connection to his story. A retired firefighter who remembered that night, a foster parent who'd read excerpts to her kids, a young police officer who said John's story reminded him why he joined the force. The camera flashes from reporters captured each moment, but John barely noticed them anymore. He was too caught up in the stories, in the impact his life had somehow made. Then, through the crowd, he spotted Stephen. His son stood quietly in line, holding his own copy of the book. John's heart hammered in his chest as Stephen approached the table. The room seemed to still as Stephen placed the book in front of him. "Will you sign mine, Dad?" John's hands trembled as he gripped the pen. He opened the front cover and with careful strokes wrote the words he'd been holding in his heart. "To my son. The second chance I never knew I needed. Dad." Stephen read the message, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, in a moment John would never forget, his son stepped forward and wrapped him in a tight hug. John closed his eyes, savoring the weight of his son's embrace, letting the moment sink deep into his soul. The aroma of roasted turkey and fresh-baked rolls filled Micah and Malachi's spacious home. Golden afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the elaborately decorated dining table. Fall-colored flowers and carefully arranged place settings made the scene look like something from a magazine. John sat in a comfortable chair, watching the bustling activity around him with contentment. Micah moved confidently through the kitchen, checking the turkey and stirring various pots. Malachi arranged the silverware with precision, making sure everything was perfect. Stephen chatted easily with Rachel as they sorted through wine bottles, their laughter mixing with the classical music playing softly in the background. "Hard to believe this is real sometimes," John murmured to himself, remembering all the lonely holidays spent in his old apartment, eating microwaved dinners and watching old movies. "All right, everyone," Micah called out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Food's ready. Let's eat." As everyone settled into their seats, Micah grinned at John. "All right, old man, say the toast." John cleared his throat, suddenly feeling emotional as he looked at the faces around him. He raised his glass, his voice steady but full of feeling. "This year I have a lot to be thankful for second chances, for family, and for finding my way home." The room erupted in cheers and glasses clinked together. Laughter filled the air as John stood to carve the turkey, a task he'd never done before. "Don't drop it," Micah teased as John carefully maneuvered the knife. "Have some faith in your old man," John shot back with a grin, successfully carving perfect slices. Later, as plates were being filled and conversations flowed, Stephen pulled John aside for a quiet moment. "Remember those Thanksgivings when I was a kid?" he asked softly. "When you'd work double shifts?" John nodded, pain flickering across his face. "I'm sorry for all those missed years, son." Stephen squeezed his father's shoulder. "We're making new memories now. That's what matters." Rachel, helping herself to more stuffing, mentioned casually, "The book's still doing amazingly well, John. I got an email yesterday about another police department using it in their training program." John just smiled, his eyes taking in the scene before him. Micah arguing playfully with Malachi about the proper amount of gravy, Stephen laughing at their antics, Rachel adding her own commentary to the debate. The acclaim and success of his book seemed far less important than these precious moments with his family. As dinner wound down and everyone sat back in their chairs, content and full, John observed the scene with deep satisfaction. The sound of genuine laughter, the warm glow of connection, the feeling of belonging. It all wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. For the first time in his life, John Callahan felt truly at peace. Delicate snowflakes drifted down from the dark winter sky, coating the ground in a pristine white blanket. Christmas lights twinkled along the eaves of John's house, casting a soft, multicolored glow across the fresh snow. Inside, the warmth of family and celebration filled every room, but John needed a moment alone with his thoughts. He stepped out onto his front porch, his breath visible in the cold night air. The wooden boards creaked softly under his feet as he moved to lean against the railing. Behind him, the screen door opened with a gentle squeak. Trying to escape the chaos? Micah's voice carried a hint of amusement as he and Malachi joined John on the porch. "Just needed some air," John replied, his voice soft. Micah handed him a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light from the Christmas decorations. "What are you thinking about?" John exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the falling snow. That night. The fire. If I hadn't gone in. Malachi shook his head, his expression serious. "Don't do that, John. You saved us. And because of that, look where we are now." A small smile tugged at John's lips. "I never thought life would bring me here." He gestured vaguely at the house, the lights, the family gathering inside. Micah patted his shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "And yet here we are." The three men settled into a comfortable silence, watching the snow continue to fall. Each lost in their own thoughts, but connected by the bonds they'd forged. The weight of guilt that John had carried for so many years seemed to lift with each passing snowflake. "We've been thinking," Malachi said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "about expanding the foundation, helping more foster kids find their way." "Could use your help with that," Micah added. "Nobody knows better than you what it means to make a difference in someone's life." John nodded, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. "I'd like that." A burst of laughter drifted out from inside the house, making all three men smile. They shared a knowing look. This was only the beginning of their journey together. John lifted his glass toward the night sky, whispered words forming in the cold air. "Merry Christmas." For the first time in his life, he felt truly whole. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the dining room. The large table groaned under the weight of Christmas dinner. Golden turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, and various pies that filled the air with their sweet aroma. Laughter and conversation flowed freely, creating a symphony of joy that filled every corner of the room. John sat at the head of the table, watching as Micah and Malachi playfully squabbled over the last slice of apple pie. "I made it!" Micah protested, reaching for the plate. "You ate most of it already," Malachi countered, blocking his brother's attempt with a fork. John chuckled, shaking his head at their antics. The sound of their bickering was music to his ears, so different from the lonely silence that had once defined his holidays. Stephen sat beside him, looking relaxed and content. He nudged his father's arm gently. "Not bad, huh?" John nodded, his eyes crinkling with happiness. "Not bad at all." Rachel Bennett stood up, raising her glass. Her eyes sparkled with warmth as she looked at John. "To John," she announced, commanding everyone's attention. "The man who saved 2 lives and got his own life in return." "To John." The room echoed with cheers and the clinking of glasses. John swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. He looked around the table at the faces of his family, not just by blood, but by choice. Micah and Malachi had paused their pie dispute to raise their glasses, grinning at him with genuine affection. Stephen sat tall beside him, pride evident in his expression. Friends and loved ones filled every chair, their presence a testament to how far he'd come. The weight of regret that had once pressed heavily on his shoulders was gone. In its place was a profound sense of gratitude. He closed his eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer of thanks. All those years of loneliness and self-doubt had led to this moment. They weren't just waiting for him to find them. He had been waiting for them too, waiting to be whole again. John leaned back in his chair, a content smile spreading across his face. For the first time in a long, long time, he was truly, completely happy. If you enjoyed the story of John, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.